Vermont Biggest Bucks Club. Have you ever wondered how old that buck that you got was? Well, today we're going to have a little bit of fun. We're going to look at the deer that I got last year and we're going to try to determine the age of that buck. And it was a 200 plus pound buck. There's three basic methods of determining the age of a deer: cementum annuli, tooth replacement, and tooth wear. Cementum annuli is what the state of Vermont does when you submit a tooth from the deer that you've harvested. They send it away, and basically they take a cross section of the tooth and then they count the rings, kind of like the growth rings on a tree. And it's a pretty accurate method of determining the age of a deer. All right, so let's talk about tooth replacement. Here's a chart that I made many years ago when I was interested in deer biology, probably over 20 years ago. Something that's kind of fun to do, you could do as well. If we look at these three lower jaw, we can clearly see they're different sizes, but that's not size isn't necessarily an indicator of age, but in this case, it happens to be true that the top jaw is very small and it's of a younger deer, and it is a half-year-old deer, and we can tell that by counting the number of teeth. We can see there's 1, 2, 3, 4 teeth here, and then there's another tooth that's just starting to erupt behind that. And then if we look at the jaw below it, we can quickly determine that this deer is older. You can see that there's more teeth here. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 teeth. And the key tooth here for this age class is this third premolar. So we have the molar starting here. And then before that, we have these 3 teeth. And this third premolar is an important tooth because it's a tricuspid, and this tooth is unique to this age class of deer. So when you see that, you can very quickly determine that this is a 1.5 year old deer. And then if we look at the jaw below, we can go to that third tooth and we see that that tricuspid is no longer there. So we know that this deer is at least 2.5 years old. And then the way to determine how old it is beyond that, other than the cementum annuli, is to then look at tooth wear. Now, I've examined the teeth on this deer, and I have determined that this deer was actually a 2.5 year old deer. All right, the next method that we're going to talk about is tooth wear. And here's the lower jaw of the buck that I harvested last year. It was a 215 pound buck. And when I brought that deer to the taxidermist, they were kind enough to honor my request. And right there, I left with the lower jaw. So I was able to then, quickly get this jaw cleaned up and ready to look at. So as we examine the teeth here, we can see right off that this has the full complement of teeth, so we know it's an adult deer. And then as we look at that third premolar that we mentioned earlier, we can see that it's not a tricuspid, it's an adult tooth. So we know that to age this deer beyond that, this is at least a 2.5 year old deer, but then to go any further, we need to look at tooth wear. And so we're going to do that now. Okay, as we look at that first molar, we can see that there's significant wear there. So we know that this buck was at least 2.5 years old. So we start to look at tooth wear of the molars. We go to that first molar, and we look at the dentin here, and you can see that there's significant wear of the teeth. And as we look particularly at the cusps in the back, these peaks, when we look at the dentin, you can see that there's significant wear, and that dentin, the staining, is larger than the enamel around it, the white. And so based upon the wear here, it's pretty easy to determine this deer is at least 3.5 years old. So determine beyond that, then we have to look at the next tooth. And we go again to these cusps, these peaks, and we can look at the dentin, We can see that there is wear, that dentin is being exposed. And there's probably almost at least 1.5 to 2 times as much dentin as there is enamel around it. So there's slightly more dentin exposed than the enamel around it. And so as we look at this deer, and then we'd say, okay, it's likely that this deer is at least 4.5 years old. But if we go and we look at the next tooth, this last molar, and we look at the dentin here, you can see in comparison how that strip of dentin is much thinner on both of these peaks here. There's maybe a little bit of wear in the tooth, but not much. And again, the dentin that's exposed is not as significant as the tooth prior. And that would lead us to conclude that this deer is very probably a deer that's 4.5 years old. It's a deer that's in its 5th year and probably not older than that. Okay, so we determined that this buck is probably 4.5 years old, the buck that I got last year. So now we're going to see how that compares with the results of the testing that the state of Vermont did, because I did submit a tooth. So we're going to go on the computer, the results are in, and we're going to see if that is accurate. All right, I've gone to the Vermont Fish and Wildlife website and I've looked at the results that they got from the centum annuli testing of the tooth that I submitted last year. And it confirms what we determined by looking at the lower jaw, that this is a 4.5-year-old buck. So that's pretty neat to see. And I'll just say that, the testing that the state of Vermont does is something that hunters should take advantage of. It's a great program. And of course, the information that they gather from that, the data, is important to the health of the herd and understanding the age structure. It's also something that's kind of fun. We can take advantage of it and think about, asking your taxidermist for the lower jaw if you're bringing your deer to get mounted. And also, even if you have a doe, asking the butcher for the head so that you can get that lower jaw, because some of the animals that have been, harvested in recent years, the testing shown that they've been, some of them are really significantly old. And, when you're talking about, I think a 19-year-old deer, that's just exceptional. And you'll never harvest a 19-year-old deer again. And so if you get a 10-year-old or even an 8 or a 12-year-old, some of these ages are just amazing. I would love to see the lower jaw of a 19-year-old deer. I can't imagine what that looked like. I think in my mind, it would just have to be worn right down to the gum line, but I don't know that for sure. I suppose there's factors that would contribute to that. But, I would encourage people to consider making yourself a chart and take advantage of the testing that the state of Vermont does. Of course, we want to support that and contribute to the health of the herd and the data that's gathered as well. The other thing that I would just say is that what this shows is that this buck that I harvested last year was 4.5 years old. It's a mature deer, but it's not exceptionally old deer. And what that shows us is that Vermont has the genetics to grow 200-pound bucks. And we know that Vermont does have the genetics to grow big, large bucks. Of course, there's a lot of factors that contribute to the age, to the health of a deer and the size of it, including winter severity and all the mass, the food that they have available to them. But Vermont does have the genetics to grow 200+ pound bucks, and that's not true in a lot of places. So, well, let's keep celebrating Vermont's great deer hunting heritage. And thanks for joining me. Until next time.